Okay, hi. My name is Justin Harrison. I am a Schusterman Reality alumni, music 2016. I'm happy to be here with Dr. Dickens to talk about Tulsa in June 16th. Dr. Dickens, can you give us a brief introduction about yourself?
Well, yes, I am at Tulsa Community College. I'm the director of culturally responsive practices. I'm also involved in the community and a few organizations that uh, center me in social justice and Greenwood area research. So I'm on the John Hope Franklin Center board as a board member, and also a chair of the curriculum committee, where we put together a curriculum surrounding Greenwood, or a resource rather than necessarily a curriculum. So educators can use it, anyone can use it to get some of the unique history that it's a compiled uh, portal of all of the resources that we were able to put together. And it's a work in progress. Every time we find something new, we add it to that portal. I'm also a commissioner for the Greater Tulsa African American Affairs Commission in Tulsa. And so the job I have at the college is in the diversity area. So we're always dealing with issues of marginalized people and trying to help with looking at places and where we all fit. And Greenwood, Black Wall Street was one of those places where we know people found a place to fit and they were succeeding. And then there were those who were jealous and came in and destroyed that community. But of course, that was not enough to hold the community down, and it
Mm,
rebuilt.
that's awesome. Tulsa right now, Black Wall Street, Juneteenth, obviously top of mind of many Americans, Black Americans, and people all across the world right now, with the President Trump, the first deciding to host a rally in Tulsa on Juneteenth anniversary, then subsequently decided to push it back to date. And obviously right now, our issues around social injustice, racial injustice, the inequities that we deal with every day in America, and police brutality, and you know these subject matters are at the top of our mind. And it seems like this is a perfect time for people to learn about Tulsa. I gotta admit, I went to mostly PWI schools my entire life, and the history of Tulsa was not taught in our education systems. I learned it from my grandfather, and I'm learning more and more every day as reflecting back on the history, because we're finding right now history is repeating itself. And so, would you mind walking us through a little bit of the history of Black Wall Street?
Absolutely. So I'm going to couch it in the idea of, I don't teach history, I teach English, but of course you can't
Mhm.
teach English if you don't teach history. So I'm going to couch my representation of Black Wall Street and Juneteenth and many of the attempts to move from slavery to freedom in this way that I learned history when I was in high school, where it talked about history is a constant tension between two powers. One, the powers that be, and the others would be the people who've come to a tipping point and they're resisting the oppression. So so I'm going to first mention that when the people basically came to a tipping point with emancipation, the Union versus the Confederacy. That was a tipping point when right had to be done, and the government that was attempting to hold on to the old values that no longer were acceptable, the emancipation occurred for just the right timing. Well, it took 2.5 years for the people in Galveston Island in Texas to hear of this, because people were trying to hide it from them, or you have to have the soldiers, the Union soldiers, coming in and removing the flag from the Confederacy so that it can be declared by law that this is Union area, this is part of the Union of the United States, and slaves are no longer considered slaves. They are now free people, and they can go about their lives as they desire. Of course, that is continually couched in several people were, I was listening to a lot of the narratives, recordings that we have at the Library of Congress, and many of the slaves who had been freed, they didn't know where to go at this point. They had this freedom, and some of them reported how they just stayed, or they weren't even told still that they were not free. But the owners, the plantation owners or the landowners, they would still do something special on June 19th, the day that the major walked in from the Union to read the order and to declare them free. They would still be able to eat, to dance, to sing, to celebrate in any way they wanted. They knew something was different on June 19th, starting in 1865, that they had been freed. So 1866, every year after that, they were doing some type of a celebration. And honestly, we were doing this until 1980. This was when they had the official, in Texas, the official declaration that this was the Juneteenth day to be celebrated by the state. Since then, we have had 45 additional states add on to declare this Juneteenth an officially recognized holiday for the states. Now, we still don't have that as a federal holiday, but the last presidents have done this, including President Trump. They have read something each year about the Juneteenth. It has always been a congressional reading on both the Senate and the House areas for them to read something to recognize the date. So it is really for African Americans, it is the July 4th for African Americans. The contradiction, of course, is that we're in the land that says we want life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness for every person, except if you are a person of color.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been the tension that we have dealt with, is that the words that found this country have not been the words that we actually live by. And so Juneteenth is important to the world. It is important to African Americans because it is the time when this country has lived up to its ideals. And so that makes it significant to the United States for sure to celebrate it, is that we have some moments when we have done the right thing. It's not liberal, it's not conservative, it's not independent, it's the right thing. So Juneteenth is about celebrating liberation for all people. It's about being human. It's about being fully human and being recognized for that. So that's what makes Juneteenth a much celebrated day within the African American community. We're heard, we can celebrate, and we do it for several days. It's not, even though Juneteenth is the day, we celebrate for at least a week.
Of course.
And even July 4th, we're still celebrating Juneteenth and recognizing that's the day about us. July 4th doesn't really capture it's more of a day of our, July 4th is more about we're still enslaved. We still have about 100 years before we even get recognized as being free in the land of the free. So July 4th is kind of hard to celebrate. Frederick Douglass noticed that when he spoke and said, this is not my holiday. This is a day that recognizes that I'm still not fully human.
Absolutely. And I think that's the plight of, Black existence, is that you're always wrestling with your place in America, right?
Mhm.
What does freedom really mean for you, right? The societal, you're always hitting up against a wall,
Right.
the society puts in front of you, and so I think that's a challenge that a lot of people are dealing with internally. I think
Mhm.
that for our white allies, this is probably one of the first times I've seen at a large scale that they're confronting this as well. And it's you see right now corporate America is getting behind celebrating Juneteenth, and using it as a holiday for employees and stuff like that. So one thing that I've always, because my grandfather did celebrate Juneteenth, and I remember growing up, going to his house. We had a picnic, and like you said, there's music, there's food, is some of the traditional ways that we do celebrate. Can you talk about some of the traditions of Juneteenth in terms of celebration?
Well, a lot of a lot of things are church based, and so you see a lot of the celebration through the church. You see a lot of the celebration now. I've seen when reading about it, of course, and thinking about its actual origins. You'll see a lot of pictures will have the barbecues, the pigs being cooked, the dancing, the singing, the just community celebrations. Um, you normally have your celebrities present, at least current day, but when you're in smaller communities, it is more about just having an opportunity to tell stories about the past and to let people know these are some things that we've gone through. I don't, it's not limited to, we don't have the same types of, it's interesting because we don't have the same types of um, things to point to that
Mhm.
others would point to, but you may hear stories about how the last battles, you may hear stories about being part of a military group that fought to defend the North versus the South. Of course, we know that people were from on all sides for different reasons, but the North took on the cause as primarily related to slavery, but also just related to, do we have a right to force a state to be part of the Union? And I do want to point out something. It's more history than responding to the specific question. But the governor, Sam Houston, who was governor when uh, the states decided to go into civil war, the governor decided that yes, he thought that Texas should break away from the Union, but he did not want Texas to go with the Confederacy. He was not prepared to go on with saying that slavery was part of it. So he actually resigned. That April, the decisions were made in January to separate the other states, the Confederate states. But once the Texas government decided to go ahead and say we want to connect with the Confederacy, Sam Houston stepped down.
Mm,
And so, I mean, that's something, just as a sort of note, that when you think about his history, there were people in Texas who were not necessarily behind slavery, but they were behind breaking away from the from the Union.
mhm,
So they had been owned, they had their own republic before, so they were accustomed to having their sovereignty, and
mhm,
so it wasn't necessarily, so he was fine with that. And so it's interesting when you talk about breaking away. Texas was sort of, they have they have the largest port for bringing in west of Louisiana, the largest port for bringing in slaves.
mhm,
So Juneteenth, things that started happening in Houston is that you had a voice of silence some of the people, many of the slaves who were in the Texas area, they left because of laws that were being made that said you either, if you stay in Texas, because once they became a state by themselves, the Republic discouraged it. But so there were a lot of pirates coming in and bringing the slaves in. And so they had a healthy economy of slavery. But when they broke away, they started, it was going to be okay. So laws started being made to say, if you stay here, you're going to be, you need to go find a master, or you need to be prepared to be captured. So you need to leave. And by the time we got to the last days of slavery, there were only two known free people who were Black people who were in Texas. So that's an interesting statistical number, that basically the Blacks had left Texas if they were free. So anyone who was in Texas was going to be a slave. But again, Juneteenth is that day when the days were silenced. People were trying to get more harvest out of the African-American slaves who were still there. And there was just this sense of, we're not going to talk about it. We're not going to defend it. We're just going to live and hope that it goes away or that it's okay. So I think this is problematic. And we're seeing that in our current day society, that when wrong is happening, silence is never the answer. There will be a tipping point, and I'm often accused of being too optimistic and saying that this will not last. The tipping point will happen. This will change. And I can just look at history. I can see that over time, history, there's a time when everyone has to choose to be on the right side or the wrong time, or the wrong side. And today, I believe, is one of those days. Juneteenth was one of those days. People fought in the Confederate and Union War, hoping that each side, one side would win, whichever side they were on. But there was a wrong side to be on. There was a moral right side to be on. And Juneteenth is a representative, it's a symbolic representation of, this is the right side and this was the right side at that time. And so, of course, the stronger celebrations of Juneteenth are going to happen to the states that are immediately next to, above, around Texas. Because people, when they would move, they're going to move to those states and they're going to continue celebrating it. And so it takes on different forms in terms of what the food is, what the celebration is. But it's always going to have the music. It's always going to have the dancing, the food, and it's going to have that memory of thankfulness. Very much like this, you can't discuss Juneteenth, at least I can't. You can't discuss Juneteenth without comparing it to Watch Meeting on January 1st. Both of them waiting for the Emancipation Proclamation. Watch Meeting in the 1863, churches were singing, praying, dancing, waiting for the news that Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation. So many of them got the news, but it took 2.5 years for the news to get to Galveston. And so then their celebrating starts later. So that's why we celebrate both days. And I will admit that as a child, as a teenager, as a young adult, I really did not understand what they meant by Watch Meeting. I did not understand what they meant by Juneteenth. I did not understand why July 4th was not the greatest holiday for African Americans. I didn't get that. But research, education helps us understand it. It's just knowing our history. We have to know that when we celebrate something, it needs to represent the inclusive access, inclusion part of us as well. And this is an example, July 4th is an example of a contradiction that can be made right. And it was made right through Juneteenth, and we need to celebrate that.
Absolutely. That's why I brought up initially that, my formal education, and I went to great schools. There was not one point I remember sitting in a class and having, even during Black History Month, when there was a conversation about Juneteenth and the historical significance of it, right? And what it really meant for African Americans, because, we're taught white history, unfortunately, in this country. And unless you cut your family or you decide to go on your own self-discovery to learn it, that information you have to do that to learn it yourself. One of the things that you said was really interesting of a tipping point, right? And I've been thinking about this a lot, that I believe that all this stuff is happening within for a reason. We are in a season of transformational change. COVID has, we've been sitting in a present of which, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is, COVID, in COVID, we've been sitting in a present, which we know we're not, a past that we're not going back to, in a future that's yet to be determined, but we're writing it right now in real time. And the fact that we are having these very frank conversations and dealing with the history of race relations in this country, right, I think is happening for a reason, because right now we're in the process of reshaping what this country is going to look like for the next 50 years. We really haven't had that tipping point and at the scale of which we're having it right now since the civil rights era, right? What my hope is that as America decides to address the sins of its past, right, and to figure out how we're going to make up for it and make the world more equitable moving forward, that this is part of that process. And America celebrating Juneteenth will be part of that process. One of the things that you brought up is the migration of slaves in Texas. You had to get out, you remain slaves in Texas, or you had to get out. Was some of that migration to Oklahoma? Oklahoma's right above Texas.
Yes.
And we're talking about, again, Tulsa is in the front mind of a lot of people right now. Was that exodus part of the formation of the Black Wall Street at that time?
Well, that would certainly be part of it, for some of the Texans to move to, Tulsa's certainly unique in how it has brought people the call to come to the Greenwood area. And the stories are, they have some similarities in terms of the reason when I was saying there's always this colliding of the oppressor and the oppressed when things just sort of collide. And every time the oppressed feels that the other side is going to potentially overcome, the song where we say, "We shall overcome," whenever that seems real, the other side gets tense.
Right.
They start wanting to throw rallies that say, "No, you have not overcome." And just wanting to put that out there is that there will always be that fight to let things stay the way they are. I mean, this happened with Juneteenth when the slave owners refused to tell the slaves because they wanted just a little more time to get their harvest. Well, with Black Wall Street, the call was to the world and to the nation that this was an area, Oklahoma was an area ripe for Native Americans, Black Americans to come to a place where slavery was not part of the formula, although that was certainly not totally true, because the Native Americans had slaves too, but and brought some of them. But then they were part of the freed groups of slaves through the Native Americans too, so we have the freedmen. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting that we had Oklahoma as a calling card for many people, for having riches, for having freedom. So within this country that espoused the values of freedom, there was created a state where you could have your freedom because you were different and you weren't going to get it in the rest of the country. So that's sort of the Oklahoma definition, but even in Oklahoma, we had laws immediately that separated segregation by trains and school systems, but Wall Street thrived because all of the businesses were African American. And the dollar within those communities, they built their businesses, built their homes, benefited from the oil in the Tulsa area, and they were able to put it into the businesses where were the only places where they could shop. And those dollars turned around some 36 to 100 times within the Tulsa Black Wall Street area.
Wow.
So because of that, the money stayed in the area as opposed to going out to other communities. And so you had affluency as the norm because everyone could be an entrepreneur and everyone could support each other. So this was actually the way things are supposed to happen. And if you have a community that has money, they're bartering with the money that they have earned to get what they want, and everyone is going to supply something that other people need. So that's perfect example of entrepreneurship where we respect one another and we share with one another. So, I know one of the things that we wanted to talk about here is that what's the lesson for us today in terms of entrepreneurs? The lesson there is that it wasn't, yes, certainly the space, the defined place was where the dollar turned around 36 to 100 times because they were forced to stay in that space, to buy in that space. Well, we are in a different place since 1921. We're almost 100 years later. So we don't need to turn the dollar around based on it being forced upon us because of segregation. We need to turn that dollar around 36 to 100 times because we're choosing to provide quality to each other. We're choosing to buy things from one another. We're choosing to look for what we can supply to meet a need for each other. That does not keep us from, just like Black Wall Street, anyone who wanted to come to Black Wall Street was always welcomed. Now, they didn't know if they were going to be picked on or discriminated against because they came to Little Africa, but everyone was welcome to come there. Well, we would still welcome the exchange of goods with other communities, and we still do. We need that. But I think primarily, and this is part of a Kwanzaa principle too, another African American tradition, that we need to support each other in terms of wealth. And so that is the one lesson in terms of Juneteenth, in terms of Black Wall Street. We can thrive as a community. We can thrive as a people if we provide that support financially, in terms of economics, in terms of commercial trade. We can still do that, but we have to be intentional. No one's going to force us to say, I know Justin is selling something that I'm interested in. And so what is it that he's doing, Justin? When you have it, I'm going to make sure I'm a regular patron for you. You should not have to wonder if people are going to come and use the service that you're providing because you know that your community is going to support you. That is the type of community that's the lesson that we learn. What we learn in bad times in terms of the struggles, we should not get to the better times where we can choose to go to any school, any job, any restaurant, any shopping mall, where we can choose to go there. We need to choose our people. We need to choose to put that 36 to 100 into action. So those are the things, the lessons from the past, the lessons from Black Wall Street, is that there is a spirit of Black Wall Street that says we do things with intention, we do things based on our abilities, we do things based on looking back at our ancestors and knowing that nothing stopped them, even being ripped from their villages, from their countries, and from their continents, and being taken across a passage of water with sickness and mistreatment, even being shamed and sold and having to rebuild or build a country based on someone else's interest, we still found a way, to connect, to build, to find greatness that honors our ancestors. So we can do that today.
Well, Dr. Dickens, that was you said you're an optimist, and that was the final message of hope. That as we go into this weekend and celebrate Juneteenth and reflect on Tulsa and Black Wall Street and looking for ways that we can recreate that in today's society, I think that message of African Americans find a way to circulate their dollar to create wealth in our own community is really probably one of the most important things that we need to think about again as we want to reshape the world post-COVID, right? So that, you know, if the next pandemic or catastrophic incident happens in this country, we aren't adversely affected in disproportionate ways, you know? So I want to thank you so much for your time. I know that this message is going to be cut and edited and be part of a larger conversation. So it has been a pleasure meeting you. I thank you so much for your time. I've learned something in this process, and I can't wait to share this with the rest of our community.
Thank you.